Andy Agathangelo. I'm carrying out this video interview of Paul Birch in my capacity as Chair of the Secretariat Committee to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Personal Banking and Fairer Financial Services. I am also, however, the founder of the Transparency Task Force, which provides the Secretariat to the All-Party Parliamentary Group. Paul, thank you very much indeed for agreeing to have this conversation with me. As you know, the conversation is being video recorded. The video recording will be placed on the APPG's website and will raise awareness of it through social media and so on. You're carrying out this video interview with me, Paul, on the basis that you have already provided a written submission to the APPG's call for evidence about the Financial Conduct Authority. So, Paul, could I please invite you first of all just to tell us a little bit about yourself and outline just briefly to begin with how you first came to interact with the Financial Conduct Authority. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andy, for the opportunity to share this on video. And in a nutshell, my initial contact with the FCA dates back to January 2017, when I first became fully aware of what has turned out to be a huge financial scam involving a HMRC registered cure ops pension trustee scheme, which was regulated in Malta by the Maltese Financial Services Authority. The link back to the FCA came about because the financial advisor who advised myself and various other members of the same scheme in Malta had on his website that he was FCA regulated and held CII advanced to G60 pension transfer qualifications and financial advice qualifications. Back in the summer of 2016, a whole raft of so-called low-risk investment recommendations that he had recommended be included in my FPI policy had either already been liquidated or were suspended. And I raised these concerns at that stage with my cure ops provider, and they became, well, the IFA and my cure ops provider became ever increasingly reluctant to address the concerns that I was sharing with them. And just before Christmas 2016, my IFA summarily resigned as my advisor, and I had no further contact with him after that date. At that stage, I contacted the FCA and the CII to share my concerns, and the FCA replied to me early in January 2017 to say that, having checked their database, both with regards to the FCA and its predecessor, the FSA, they had no record whatsoever of either my IFA or his associated companies having been regulated by them whatsoever. So that was my initial contact with the FCA in 2017. And since that time, I have been in contact with them hundreds of times, both directly and through my MP and other regulators, to question why, if at that stage they were aware that the IFA had never ever been regulated by themselves, and there was an HMRC cure ops involved and the Maltese FSA were involved, why did they never ever pursue any line of investigation with myself or with the other regulators? So that was when it all started, and unfortunately since that time there's been no improvement in their level of performance as far as I can determine.
Thank you, Paul. On to question number two. What did you invest in and when, and what went wrong?
The initial investment was made, well, going back to the summer of 2016, I transferred across into the Maltese Cure Ops 3 separate pension pots that had accrued whilst I've been working in the UK, and a total of 700 and some odd £1,000 were then transferred into the MCTML, so that's the MC Trustees Malta Limited Cure Ops, and in the autumn of and then from a chronological point of view, in August of 2016, the Cure Ops provider opened a policy with French Provident International in the Isle of Man, and then as these pension pots were released from the UK into the scheme in Malta, 2 separate tranches of investments were then transferred across the Isle of Man, and a series of so-called low-risk investments recommended by the IFA were put in place by the Cure Ops provider, and a total of around about £600,000 altogether were invested with French Provident International. There were initially 13 different investments or bonds bought, all of which I had been assured were low risk and offered a full platform of diversification, so that I would not be overloaded in any one particular sector of investments. But as I say, unfortunately, bitter experience has since shown that these were just one high risk, huge commission paying investments after another. And as I say, by the summer of 2016, the vast majority of these investments were either already suspended or had been liquidated.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. Question number 3, I think you've touched on this already, Paul, but the question is, if you're happy to mention it, how much money did you invest and how much of that money do you have left?
The total investments at the outset, as I say, were from memory something like well in excess of £500,000. And at today's date, those investments are now worth around about £140,000.
Thank you, Paul. On to question number 4. So what was supposed to happen and what actually happened as far as you know?
Well, the proposal that was put forward to me by the IFA prior to transferring into the Cure Ops was that because of the perceived tax advantages of the investments not being taxed in the UK, I would be able to enjoy a better rate of return on those investments than would have been available had my pension remained within the UK pension system. And I think experience since has shown me that this was the standard line of attack, for want of a better word, that was used by the IFA and other IFAs to persuade people to invest in the Cure Ops. And I was told that, and this was confirmed in writing, that I could expect a much better rate of return on those investments than would have been available within the pension funds that I was already invested with in the UK. Subsequently, of course, and this took my UK solicitors' involvement, documents were eventually eked out from both the Cure Ops provider and French Provident in the Isle of Man, which then displayed that the reality of what had happened was very far removed from what I had been told would happen. And that was when, if you like, the increased contact with the FCA became more involved, because as more and more information was released by FPI to my UK solicitors, it became clear that these investments were anything but low risk, and that my Curops provider had actually waived their right for any correspondence that was passing between the IFA and French Provident to be shared with them. So that was a fundamental flaw in their fiduciary duty of care by the Curops providers to protect the interests of the beneficiaries, the contributors, and the members of that scheme. I shared numerous documents with the FCA explaining the situation, and their stock answer was and remains that although FBI at that stage were FCA regulated, the fact that the jurisdiction of our Curops provider lay in Malta meant that they were not interested or in a position to pursue this, despite the fact that the IFA had claimed fraudulently that he was regulated and operating out of the UK, and the fact that, as I say, FBI at that stage were, and I believe still are, also FCA regulated. And it just staggers belief that with those clearly defined links back to the UK and UK regulated entities and individuals, that they basically washed their hands of it.
Thank you. I'm going to move on now to question number 5, Paul, and that is this. So what, if anything, do you believe the FCA could have done that may have prevented you from allegedly being scammed in the first place?
Well, I think I've already touched on this briefly, bless you, that back in 2017, I had an email from them confirming that my IFA had never ever been FCA regulated. And there are, I have subsequently discovered, memoranda of understanding between the the FCA and their counterparts in the Isle of Man and the Isle of, and in Malta, that they should have at least, I would have thought, made contact with those regulators to highlight the suspicions, which even at that stage were fairly well documented, to say, can you work with us to advise how many other clients in Malta and in the Isle of Man you have who have been advised by this same IFA, but nothing, as far as I can determine, since 2017 has been done to pursue those avenues, despite the thousands of pages of documents that have been shared with them meantime.
Thank you, Paul. On to question number 6, and again, you touched on this already, Paul. What interaction have you had with the FCA about what's happened?
Well, initially, I was making direct contact with them, as indeed had my UK solicitor. He submitted a formal complaint, which ran to, the complaint itself ran to some 18 pages, and the amount of supporting documents that he provided was such a size that he had to submit 3 tranches of documents by email to support the allegations we were making. The stock answer was and remains that it is nothing to do with us, because jurisdiction of the Curops provider remains in Malta. So despite the fact that you have FCA regulated individuals or at least purported regulated individuals and entities, they just ignored the links back to the UK, despite the fact that the raft of breaches of the FCA Code of Conduct ran, as I say, to 18 pages or thereabouts in the letter of complaint, all supported with documents to prove those points. It's staggering, truly staggering.
Thank you again, Paul. On to question number 7. How well or badly do you think the FCA performed in your case?
Abysmally. How on earth a regulatory body can, in all consciousness, decide that despite the overwhelming evidence of malpractice by their so-called regulated individuals and entities has been ignored. I cannot in my wildest dreams wonder how anybody with any moral sense of what is right and wrong can just ignore all this evidence. It's heartbreaking.
Number 8, Paul. What do you believe the FCA could have done better once they were aware that there was a problem?
Again, I've touched on this. I just can't understand how, and as we went through the process of complaining, logic would have dictated that presumably at some stage senior management would have been called in and say, what do we do about this? And this included, as I say, the complaint submitted by my UK lawyer. And then in the summer of 2020, I also got in touch with my local MP, Rob Roberts, who was on your committee, because that old cliche, it was like knocking your head against a brick wall, has never been truer. It didn't seem to matter how much information was shared with them. It was just always pushed back. It's out of our jurisdiction. Unbelievable.
Thank you. On to the next question. What would you say about the FCA's effectiveness and timeliness in taking action to protect consumers?
Well, here we are, 6 years almost on from my initial complaint to them, and nothing has happened. So they've done nothing in that intervening period, despite the best efforts of myself initially, subsequently supported by my UK lawyer, subsequently supported by my local MP. And I keep getting the same vapid answers that it's nothing to do with the UK. You should take it up with the local law enforcement agencies, you should take it up with the regulators in Malta, etc., 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 which they are fully aware I have been doing. I mean, I have an ongoing litigation case in Malta against the cure provider and their UK administrative services functions supplier, which has been, well, the original documents were submitted before the courts in Malta in March 2018, and that is still at the preliminary hearing stage. So, words fail me.
Well, thank you. Number 10. How helpful has the FCA been to you and others affected in securing redress from the alleged guilty parties and in prosecuting or banning them so they can't do it again?
Totally ineffectual. I mean, they hide and have hidden behind this screen that, unfortunately, because the cure provider is in the jurisdiction of Malta, the insurers are within the jurisdiction of the Isle of Man. There's no action that they can take, despite, as I say, the various memoranda of understanding which are in place between Malta and the FCA and between the FCA and the Isle of Man FSA. It's just a convenient excuse to wash their hands of the affair, as far as I can understand, and it is a view which I know is shared by certainly the victims of the same cure-op scandal and the provider in Malta.
Number 11, Paul. What are your thoughts on whether the FCA lacks the powers that it needs, or conversely, that it doesn't make good use of the powers that it already has?
My own view is that they don't make use of the powers that they have. And I refer back to the initial complaints that my solicitor in the UK submitted to the FCA, which, as I say, ran to some 18 pages with mountains of supporting documents, which spelled out dozens of breaches of their own code of conduct by FPI, which is FCA regulated, and the fact that the IFA purported to have been regulated by them, and the FCA confirmed in an email in January of 2017 that the IFA had never ever been regulated. So they've had all the information there. Their own code of conduct has been breached numerous times with supporting documents which provide all the evidence that they would have needed to demonstrate that the code of conduct had been breached. And yet they've done nothing, despite also having the power to have worked within the memoranda of understanding which are in place between the UK and Malta and the Isle of Man. It beggars belief. It truly, truly does. But they just have taken no action.
Paul, just before I move on to the next question, you've made reference to FPI a few times. That's Friends Provident International, is that correct?
It is indeed, yeah.
Okay. Number 12. In general terms, how would you describe what it's been like dealing with the FCA?
Soul destroying. It's as simple as that. Since 2016, I have literally spent thousands and thousands and thousands of hours researching, trying to increase the number of people who have likewise been affected by the same actions or inactions of the FCA, who were also involved by or in the same cure-ops in Malta. Separately, although it is also relevant, the MFSA last year fined our cure-ops provider €160,000 for having breached just 6 of the many infractions of the Pension Act of 2011 in Malta. The cure-ops provider then immediately launched an appeal, which is now being heard by the Financial Services Tribunal in Malta. And at a recent hearing, one of the directors of the cure-ops provider let slip that this one provider alone had between 60 and 70 members who had been advised by this IFA, who has subsequently absconded, and despite requests, the law enforcement agencies in the UK, the Isle of Man and Malta, to trace him, and his company was registered in Panama, and the certificate of incorporation going back to 2011 showed UK passports of both him and his wife, and also gave the addresses of his 2 married daughters in South Wales, who were fellow directors of his company in Panama. Nobody has actually bothered to pursue this. And as I say, you do become so discouraged that despite all this evidence being laid on a plate for them, individually and collectively, nobody has either wanted to or been prepared to take the bull by the horns and follow up on all this information which has been shared with them. Yeah, heartbreaking, it truly is.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. On to question number 13. What is your perception of the culture of the FCA, and what do you think about it?
Well, from my own personal experience, and it's becoming clear that my circumstances are not those of a lone voice, if you like. It is clear that either under instruction from above, whoever that above is, they are told not to rock the boat, because obviously the likes of French Provident International and other large insurers have sold thousands and thousands of these policies down the years, and the losses incurred across the board run into many hundreds of millions of pounds, because I understand there are separate class actions being taken against the insurers on the Isle of Man. The only reasonable conclusion that I am able to draw is that there has been a conspiracy by those involved to try and keep a lid on all of this, because of the reputational damage that could well ensue if this comes out into the public domain. As a slight aside, I've also been pursuing this with the Serious Fraud Office in the UK, because they currently have a court case being heard in Southwark Crown Court against 3 individuals involved in just one of the liquidated bonds that was included in my portfolio. To date, the SFO's position is that they are not in a position to pursue an investigation into my particular cure ops, which again defies logic, because the investigation into this failed fund, the losses incurred there are somewhere around £100 million. But if you take into account that that was just one of more than a dozen funds which were included in my initial portfolio, which have subsequently either been totally liquidated or suspended with very poor returns from the liquidators back into the policies. Again, it just defies logic as to why the SFO had adopted this position, which again reinforces my personal belief that there is a conspiracy amongst them all to cover this up.
Thank you again, Paul. On to question number 14. What do you think about the possibility of conflict of interest issues at the FCA?
Well, logic again would indicate that the FCA, being the public face of the regulatory body in the UK to ensure that the financial services industry is well regulated, and therefore the UK is an attractive place for global companies to base their activities, when taken in the context of their failures to address the overwhelming credible evidence we have supplied with them that there has been wide-ranging and long-established malpractice within these international regulated insurers and so on. The only logical conclusion that there has of them not taking decisive action against so many of the complaints is that there is a conspiracy and a conflict of interest within the FCA to actually use the powers that they have available to bring about convictions and put a stop to it all.
Number 15. Have you ever complained officially about the FCA? If so, to whom and what happened?
Well, as I said already, my UK solicitor submitted official complaints to the FCA back in 2018 and 19. Since 2020, I have been in contact with my local MP, who has had numerous correspondence with the FCA, and he too gets basically what can be best described as fob-off responses, saying that it is not within their power and so on to investigate because the jurisdiction lies outside of the UK. From those who are involved in it. Yeah, just staggering.
Paul, number 16. Overall, what have been the overall, what have been the consequences to you and, if relevant, your family as a result of what's happened?
They've been catastrophic. We obtained green cards to emigrate to the US after my retirement. All the financial planning that I had done indicated that we would be able to enjoy the retirement that we had planned. But obviously the failures of the investments made by the rogue IFA meant that by 2018, the only logical solution was to return to the UK because basically the money was running out at a vast rate of knots. This is the other part that I can't quite get my head around, is that I am but one of thousands of people who find themselves in the same position as a result of these pension scams. So if others likewise, and many have lost virtually everything they had saved, if they come back to the UK government is going to end up subsidising them with benefits and all the rest of it. And I just, as I say, the logic of what is happening doesn't stack up, I don't think, if anybody can sit down and actually analyse the financial consequences which come back to the UK, irrespective of the moral ineptitude of the FCA for failing to investigate and then use the powers that they have to bring the perpetrators of these crimes to heel.
Well, thank you very much indeed. On to number 17. If you could change 3 things about the FCA, what would they be, Paul?
Well, the first thing is to make proper use of the powers that they have. Now, whether they are under instruction not to do that is a separate question, I suppose. But assuming that they are not under instruction not to pursue investigations where malpractice or whatever, however you want to describe it, has been identified, then it begs the question of, are the people that are employed there diligent enough or keen enough to actually earn the salaries that they're being paid and do the job that they're meant to do and pursue these investigations? Because the evidence, as I say, has been before the FCA, in my personal case, since January 2017. And despite my UK lawyers making attempts to get them to take action and my MP, nothing has changed. And Andrew Bailey, in, I think it was his annual report of 2019, said that the days of people just ticking boxes were over, and that those who were identified as having failed to protect the interests of the consumers would be brought to heel. Well, there is scant evidence of that having been delivered. So, yeah, as I say, it's difficult to quantify quite how much money has been stolen, I use the word advisedly, from the pension savers, but it'll run into millions and millions and millions. And that money has not disappeared. It's obviously been recycled in one way or another. And the victims have relied upon the regulator to protect their interests and so on. And there's scant evidence of them actually being interested or prepared to take the action that they are empowered to do.
Paul, thank you. In your written submission, you make reference to Hillsborough, the horrific footballing tragedy. Would you like to speak to the point that you make in your written submission about that matter, please?
Well, I have been a fanatical Liverpool supporter for years and years and years, and was at that game. Fortunately, my seat was in the upper section of the Liming Road, but I was obviously fully aware of what was happening below me. And when the game was subsequently abandoned, walking out of the stadium, there you could see bodies being laid against the perimeter wall. And as this thing played out down the ears, it is clear that, again, the establishment was doing its level best to ensure that those who had made wrong decisions were trying their level best to obfuscate and deny liability. And it is only now, in the recent past, some 30 plus years later, that the original coroner's decision of the now 97 victims of that disaster were unlawfully killed. But still, there has been not a single prosecution brought against those whose decisions ruined the lives of the families involved, and indeed, left emotional scars on those that were there and witnessed what was happening. We all make mistakes. My mistake was believing that the FCA and the other regulators would actually take the action that is required to protect our interests. And yes, the Hillsborough thing has been a motivator for me, because as long as the establishment is able to deny justice, there is no hope for what I believe justice being served that we deserve. Right is right, and wrong is wrong. As I say, I fully acknowledge that we all make mistakes, and that is part of the human thing. But when people make mistakes, somebody somewhere should be prepared to stand up and fight for those who have suffered as a result of those mistakes, whether it's financial or emotional or whatever. We deserve far, far better than the way we've been treated.
Well, thank you for explaining that. Thank you very much indeed for explaining that. Question number 18. What positives are there about the FCA that you'd like to talk about?
I can't think of a single positive from my personal experience. I can only hope that at some stage the amount of pressure which hopefully will ensue from our efforts will cause them to fundamentally review what they have done, but more importantly, what they have failed to do. Maybe there should not be a regulator who has perhaps, or can argue that they have to sit on the fence, because obviously the financial services arena is a huge revenue generator for the UK economy. So the commercial argument could well be made that it would be counterintuitive for a regulator to be throwing its weight around against the plethora of insurers and banks and so on who are involved in these scams, because it would damage Britain's reputation as a financial centre. But I think the ICIJ and other similar investigative journalists bodies have opened a huge can of worms now, and it is obvious that so many jurisdictions have historically turned blind eyes to financial malpractice. But I think when you get people who have saved hard for their retirements from tax-paid income at that, to then be abandoned by the FCA, it begs the question quite where the moral compass lies, because crime is crime. And the unfortunate part is that financial crime seems to be increasingly easy to commit, and the regulators are seemingly increasingly reluctant to get involved and fight our cause.
Number 19, Paul, do you believe there should be spot checks by the FCA on regulated and or unregulated entities, perhaps similar to the spot checks by VAT inspectors?
Absolutely, because as the sort of 6 years of investigative work that I've undertaken with relation to my own cure ops, these are consummate con men and women who know exactly how to manipulate the regulations to their own advantage. The case in point being that the owner at the time when I joined my cure ops was sitting on several UK pension advisory boards. So his subsidiary company, which was supplying the administrative function to his Maltese subsidiary, was not FCA regulated, even though all the other companies in his group, which he subsequently sold in 2016 to another FCA regulated and LSE listed company, were. So call me cynical, but my assumption is that the reason that his administrative function supplier was not FCA regulated was because, of course, they would not have run the risk of being inspected by the FCA. So so spot checks are obviously, as far as I'm concerned, a prerequisite. But again, the problem would be that you would need to have people going in who are conducting these investigations that have been well trained to be aware of the potential loopholes, and that those loopholes are examined, because as we have found out, the professional scammers are able to circumvent most, if not all, of the regulations with total impunity. It's, yeah, simple as that, in my opinion.
Thank you again, Paul. Number 20, the FCA is currently undertaking a transformation project. Do you have any comments that you'd like to make about that?
Well, transformation probably is a kind word to be using. My own view is that the whole thing should just be dismantled and probably split into two separate units, because, as I say, the conflict of interests, to my mind, are there for all to see. If the FCA is part and parcel of the framework which attracts financial services companies to locate and be regulated in the UK, they are not then clearly going to be too motivated to investigate and prosecute the miscreants who have and are committing financial scams on a huge scale. You know, you cannot have, to quote that famous saying, you can't put a fox in charge of the chicken house. So, yeah, a fundamental review of quite how it's, what the roles are of the FCA needs to be undertaken, because as I see it at the moment, they are achieving nothing at all to protect the interests of a consumer.
Paul, question number 21, which is actually the final question, very straightforwardly, are there any other comments that you would like to make?
The only comment I would like to make is that if anybody views this video and they have been affected, please pursue it, because the more noise we can make, the better the chances we will have of bringing about a fundamental review of the way that financial crime is treated in the UK. Please get in touch with Andy and join the club.
Paul Birch, thank you very much indeed, not just for your written submission that you kindly provided the APPG previously, but also for your willingness to participate in this video conversation today. Paul Birch, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Andy, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you very much indeed.